Liberia is a country just over the size of Tennessee, located on the western coast of Africa. It has a population of around 4 million people, comprised of both indigenous peoples and those of African American descent. Its government, established by freed American slaves that were sent back to Africa, is a republic modeled after the American government. Liberia is a state rich in farmland and natural resources like timber, rubber, and diamonds. Its form of government is also modeled after that of the wealthiest country in the world. Yet, Liberia is one of the poorest countries with a GDP of $2.693 billion US, $700 US dollars per capita. It is ranked 225th in the world, placing it somewhere near the bottom. In comparison, the US has a GDP of around $50,000 per capita, and it complains about an unemployment rate of 9%. Liberia has an unemployment rate of 85%, and 80% of its people are below the poverty line. Alas, despite its wealth of natural resources, Liberia is a country that depends mainly on agriculture and foreign aid for money. It has little to no industrial growth. This is because events in Liberia's past have ruined its economy, leaving it in the poor state that it's in today. These events include the withdrawal of support by the ACS, American Colonization Society, from Liberia a bit after the country's founding, Liberia's dependency on foreign loans and contracts, and the recent Liberian civil wars. These events caused Liberia's economy, which at one point was the fastest growing in the world, to crash and burn. Liberia was founded by freed American slaves who were sent back to Africa in order to solve the problem of the growing freed slave population in America. As a result, the American Colonization Society was founded in order to help bring freedom to Africa. One of the ways it did that was it helped found Liberia and supported it with funds in its early years. However, the ACS eventually became overly financially burdened, and it had to withdraw that support from Liberia, leaving it to fend for itself. Trade in Liberia was flourishing at that time, but as its borders expanded, so did its economic difficulties escalated, and its difficulties in controlling the indigenous people of Liberia also increased. Without the support of the ACS, Liberia had no money to modernize and industrialize its economy, leaving it based almost completely on agriculture today. Liberia also had to resort to borrowing foreign money, and as a result, it is heavily dependent on countries like Britain and America. It had to even out the gap between import costs and export revenues. The imports of necessities, which Liberia could not provide for itself due to its lack of industrialization, far outweighed the revenue it gained from its commodity exports. This excessive borrowing caused Liberia's bankruptcy in 1909, and even then it was forced to continue borrowing, attempting to decrease its debts by creating more debt. Had the Liberian government been able to modernize its economy, the cost of exports would not be nearly as much, and it could have even potentially exported its manufactured goods as well, creating new industry and increasing revenue. Unfortunately, Liberia could not afford to modernize without the help of the ACS, leaving its economy an agricultural and commodities economy, both of which are not sustainable long-term. Although the ACS was growing as well, without its aid, Liberia's economy wasn't able to change and develop into a more self-sustainable, healthy economy. It instead had to resort to borrowing from foreign countries and eventually signing contracts with foreign companies as well, mainly American. Large American companies, such as Firestone, made contracts with Liberia to obtain large pieces of its land. Liberia didn't have much choice in the matter because it desperately needed the money. However, these contracts were extremely unfair to the Liberians and heavily benefited the American companies. These companies used the huge pieces of land to get rubber, timber, and various minerals extremely cheaply, and they also employed Liberians for labor. Under the employment of these companies, the Liberians were treated almost as slaves were treated. Their hours were long, their pay too low to subsist on, and they had basically no human rights. Liberia was supposed to be the ideal African country, the only one that was free and self-governing at that time, but under these conditions, it was not much more than an American colony. As America grew rich off the labor of Liberians, Liberia grew poor due to the contracts that were skewed so much in favor of the Americans. This colonization effectively held back Liberia's economic development, just as it had with all the other African countries. Liberia was hugely dependent on these companies for revenue, and it had no means of actually taking its own natural resources and manufacturing them into products by itself because it had no factories. There were no plans for factories either because it had the contracts with the companies and it could not afford to, on the meager income, to actually start these companies. The foreign companies were simply taking Liberia's resources and profiting from them, paying almost nothing for them. And Liberians were struggling to make a living under their employment. Eventually, the League of Nations intervened when accusations that the Liberians were working under extremely harsh and inhumane circumstances turned out to be true, but the damage was already done. Besides the revenue from foreign countries, Liberia only had its agriculture and its exports, which weren't contracted with the foreign companies, but neither of these are very profitable. It depended too much on foreign sources of income, those contracts, and when those contracts disappeared, its GDP took a big hit. Under President William Tubman, economic conditions improved greatly, but his presidency actually became authoritarian. Dissension among the people gradually increased, especially among the lower class indigenous Liberians, who had much fewer rights than the Africans of American descent. Tubman's successor was unable to retain control over Liberia, and Samuel Doe, a general in the Liberian army, seized power in a military coup. He was well supported because he represented the indigenous people of Liberia, but as his presidency became more corrupt, he lost that support, and Charles Taylor, leader of